My name is Michael Schratt. I'm a military aerospace historian. Primary focus of my research deals with classified aircraft developed within the military-industrial complex. Started this line of research about 30 years ago, tracking down test pilots, engineers, people who worked on classified programs, and started piecing this mosaic together of this black world. How do you tell the difference between a man-made vehicle and an extraterrestrial vehicle? It is at the point now that it is seamless. It's almost impossible to tell who's who. But 2 points I want to point out. If you hear about a vehicle, or if you see a vehicle firsthand that's tested on a Thursday night, there's a strong possibility it's ours. If you see a vehicle that has bulkheads, that has transparent panels, and has rivets fastening this together with an electrical humming noise, there's a very strong possibility it's one of ours. But at this point, it's reached a segment of the technology where it's seamless. If the extraterrestrial vehicles are being mixed in with our man-made vehicles, you'd never tell the difference. That's how far the technology has progressed. Unequivocally, without question, that there is a black world out there. There is a black landscape that we don't know anything about, exempt from congressional oversight. It has no public scrutiny, and that is just a tip of the iceberg of what's actually there. There are dozens of programs that we still don't know about. There could actually be hundreds, but there are at least dozens of classified black budget programs that we don't know anything about. And I will refer you to a quote by President Abraham Lincoln when he stated that you can fool all of the people some of the time. You can fool some of the people all of the time, but you can't fool all of the people all of the time. We're not going to be fooled anymore thinking that everything is alien. We've already proven that a lot of these are our own aircraft because of the truss beams, because of the rusty rivets, because of the electrical humming noise, because of the electric coronal that we see on the front side of the craft. That's indicative of a high voltage electrical charge. So we just won't be fooled anymore. The reason why I'm passionate about it is because it could change the world. We are between 100 and 400 years behind where we should be right now. We're living in a matrix. This is not the real world. We don't need internal combustion vehicles. We don't need coal fire plants. We don't need wind generating windmills. We don't need solar power. All of that is obsolete technology. We could be living at least 100 years beyond what we're living now. And when you can control gravity, you can control time. We could be looking at something way more advanced than we could even dream of. That's the reason why I'm into it. We could change the quality of life for everyone on this planet instantly with this technology. That's why I'm in it. And the only way that's going to happen, according to Gordon Cooper, who's our original Mercury 7 astronaut, is if the scientific community comes together as a united coalition and usurps and goes over the head of the defense contractors. And unless and until that happens, we're still going to be living in this level 1 society using these old gasoline-powered vehicles with these coal fire plants and these nuclear power generating reactors. We're going to be living in this obsolete world for the next 100, 500 years if we don't take and break away and take matters into our own hands. We've got to do it for our children, for our future generations. We've got to do it. We've already made the gravity breakthrough, according to Dr. Greer, and it's absolutely referenced in the works, that we've made the gravity breakthrough October 1954. Factor in the billions we've already spent on these programs, over all that time period, you know they've made the breakthrough. You know that we don't need liquid rockets to get in space now. And all this stuff about the Saturn V rocket and the space shuttle using liquid rockets, we're talking about obsolete Model T Ford backwards dinosaur technology using liquid rockets. There's a better way to go to space. They made the breakthrough October 1954. In this particular sighting, there were at least 24 naval officers on the deck of the USS FDR that when they looked up above the deck of the USS FDR, they saw this craft approaching the aircraft carrier, and this thing parked itself over the flight deck. There were at least 24 naval officers who saw this, and what they saw was a at least 100-foot long cigar-shaped craft that had what were termed square windows, and then there were what were termed beings looking back at them, waving back at the aircraft carrier, people on the aircraft carrier flight deck looking back at them. So this is late 1958. This is the USS FDR. I actually tracked down the original eyewitness on this particular case and was able to secure the paperwork, the documentation, and the original sketch. You can see the FDR here. These are the naval officers here, and you can see the box-type windows. And then this craft came down so low that the naval personnel on the deck of the aircraft carrier could actually feel the heat emanating from the craft on their faces. That's how low this thing was. And then this thing took off from their location. But there were multiple eyewitnesses. It's been confirmed. It probably was put into logbooks. Those logbooks are no longer available, but this is a multi-witness case from credible naval officers. Many of our naval warships have been basically tracked and followed by UFOs, by USOs. At least 51% of UFO cases are, in point of fact, USO cases, unidentified submerged objects, where these craft have been seen bursting out of the ocean and flying right off into space, being tracked by radar, being scrambled. F-4 Phantoms trying to track these craft. They could not be tracked by our naval aircraft. No way. Way beyond our capability. We're talking about 1958 here technology. So who was flying these things out of the ocean? Who was, tracking our naval submarines at over 160 knots back in the 1960s? These occurrences did take place, no doubt about it. There's two reasons why they would want to keep it secret. Number one, they want to control the high ground, because anyone who controls the high ground in a battlefield environment wins that battle, no question about it. If you've got black triangles, TR-3Bs, hovering over a battlefield, monitoring the situation, and you've got military assets within those triangles, you're going to win that war. There's no question. You've got the high ground. The other reason is the propulsion system associated with these craft would essentially make all the utilities null and void. We wouldn't need coal fire plants. We wouldn't need nuclear power reactors anymore. We could tap and access the ambient zero-point energy field, and we wouldn't be metered anymore. We could do away with the oil industry. That's the other reason why they're keeping this under wraps. Those are the two reasons. What I want to show you is three cases that I have to be honest, I think we're looking at a man-made technology that people are mistaking as alien. In this case, this was seen by a woman driving home from a dinner engagement back in 1983. She heard this real loud explosion. Her car started vibrating. She pulled off to the side of the road thinking the transmission fell out. She checked the bottom of the vehicle, and there was nothing wrong with her car, so she kept on going. And then off to the right in a clearing, she saw what she described as being approximately a 165-foot long craft that was about 60 feet tall. It had multiple port windows in the craft. It had two sections up here with what looked like 5'10" white single-piece tight-fitting flight suit individuals that looked completely oblivious to what she was seeing from her ground location. It also had what appeared to be tubes, pipes, and cylinders on the left side of the vehicle with a door that was closing from right to left. There was also an asphalt road section on the inner bottom section of the vehicle. And then she described what she stated were 12-inch by 12-inch square, highly polished mirrors on the bottom of it. I want to point out that she also saw inside this craft, and she termed what she saw was naval bulkheads like a shipyard. She also identified rivets holding this particular craft together. This came from the newspaper clipping. I've got the actual newspaper report here. Story behind this case: gentleman was driving to work in the morning. He saw two bright lights near his location. He actually followed these lights around the bend, and then before he knew it, he saw what he termed to be an elliptical UFO with a notch cut out of the back. It was about 65 feet across. It had two powerful beaming spotlights in the front, but then on the bottom of this craft that he could see outside his window, he saw these silencers, tubes, pipes, and cylinders like a Midas muffler plant on the bottom surface of this vehicle, and this craft slowly passed his location. So now we've got 13 cases of this understructure indicative of a man-made technology. This is a case where a gentleman was driving to work in the morning. He was on a motorcycle, and all of a sudden his motorcycle stopped dead, had no idea why. Next thing he knew, he was bathed in a white light. He looked up and saw a square hovering above his location, and there were these brilliantly lit white lights shining down on him, and he was looking at the bottom of a structure that had tubes, pipes, and cylinders on the bottom. And as this thing passed by, he immediately identified that he wasn't looking at just the bottom square, but he was looking at, in point of fact, the bottom of a pyramid. He ended up walking his motorcycle 3 miles all the way back home, and when investigators got to him later and interviewed him about 2 weeks later, one investigator had a metal lighter that he pulled out of his pocket, and as soon as he pulled that lighter out of his pocket, it leaped out of his hand and went right to the gas tank of his motorcycle. The entire motorcycle had become magnetized. So this is just another CE2 case, because not only was it a visual, but it had a physical aspect as well. So we're no longer talking about just a CE1 case. Where you can get the reference for this is Aviation Week, Space Technology, Jane's Defense Weekly. You can go to a reference library like ASU where they have government publications, and you can read about these programs for yourself, like B2, F-117, A-12 Avenger 2. That is available to the public. It's declassified. At one time, these were deep black programs that were still within that unacknowledged special access program world, within Skunk Works, within Boeing Phantom Works, within the Northrop Black Widow group. At one time, they were super secret black. Now they're declassified. But I'm just making the point, there's so many more that we don't know about, and that's one way you can research it, by going to those university archives. But as far as those, the telltale signs of the us versus them, I mean, obviously, if you're looking at rivets, if you're looking at cross-beam girder construction, if you're looking at composite panels using quasi-crystals, using electrochromic panels, where they have the technology now, and this is a technology that's decades old now, where they can take an image of something that's in front or on the top surface of the aircraft, and they can electrically transfer that image on the bottom of the aircraft, essentially causing it to blend in with the background, making it completely invisible. Now we're talking about daytime stealth technology. They don't have to do this in nighttime anymore. They can have a craft flying directly overhead, totally silent, and you would never even know it because it's blending in with the background. They've got the technology. We're going to consider Mr. Ben Rich, who's the head of Lockheed Skunk Works between 1975 to 1991. Ben passed away in 1995. He was a good friend of Jim Goodall, who is a black aircraft researcher. And just prior to Ben's passing, Jim Goodall wrote a letter to Ben Rich asking if he would be interested in doing a non-holds-barred interview. Ben would just lay everything out that he had been working on at the Skunk Works. This meeting was agreed upon by Ben Rich. He actually agreed to do this interview. Unfortunately, Ben Rich passed away before Jim could actually interview Ben Rich on tape. However, Jim was successful in getting in one last telephone call into Mr. Ben Rich at the hospital, and Ben Rich told Jim Goodall over the phone, Jim, we have things in the Nevada desert that are 50 years beyond what you could comprehend. If you've seen it on Star Wars or Star Trek, we've been there, done that, or decided it wasn't worth the effort. That's a direct quote from Ben Rich. So we have that from the head of Lockheed Skunk Works talking about programs that are 50 years beyond what we could even comprehend. Coming from him, that's a significant statement. Now, do we have anything to back this up? We actually do. This is the Skunk Works Management Style by Ben Rich. This is AIAA technical paper published September 7th, 1988. And in this document, it makes a very interesting statement from Ben Rich. And he says here, quote, I wish I could tell you about the projects we are currently working on. They are both fascinating and fantastic. They call for technologies once only dreamed of by science fiction writers. So talking about technologies that are fascinating, fantastic, and things that only science fiction writers could dream of. So there's absolutely no telling what the Skunk Works could actually do, what they're capable of. Ben also stated that anything you can imagine the Skunk Works can do. I mean, they can do it. They have absolutely made the breakthrough. We now have the technology to take ET home. This is borne out by the technology. This is borne out by the black budget, by the 80% of programs that the Skunk Works is designing and working on is completely black at this time. So there's no telling just how far Lockheed and all the other defense contractors have taken this technology. They could absolutely take it beyond the moon and probably interstellar at this point. Are we interacting with alien beings? Is there a liaison? That is the $64 million question. Have we had these crash retrievals? For me personally, I take a more conservative route. I only like to stay with the nuts and bolts that we can pin down. The evidence is clear that a lot of these craft built with our tax dollars, they mimic the form, fit, and function of what are termed as extraterrestrial UFOs. To me, I just think that 95% of what is being reported as extraterrestrial UFOs are in point of fact our own deep black programs built by man-made technologies within the Skunk Works, within the Phantom Works. If there is a sighting of one of our black aircraft, be it on purpose or accidentally, in many cases the next day you'll read about that sighting in the tabloid checkout counter, right? And that is used as a diversionary tactic to keep people like you and I from looking into those aircraft. That's the tactic they've used for over 50 years. Why would they stop using it now? So that's what we're up against. We are up against the best of the best, the guys who control this technology, the defense contractors, the intelligence community, the people at the Pentagon and the procurement office that are in bed with the defense contractors. These guys are good. They'll stop at nothing to muddy the waters. That's what we're up against. False flags are as old as war itself. We have to figure out a new enemy to fight to justify spending billions of dollars for additional weapons of mass destruction. We've got to do it. Now that Saddam is gone, now that Gaddafi is gone, now that bin Laden is gone, we need a new enemy. We need a new reason to justify billions of dollars in defense contracts. So they'll invent something called nations of concern, like Carol talks about, where it's a multi-headed hydra and there's not one central place. They're all over, they're global. So this is like an ongoing war that could never be fought and never be won. This is great for defense contractors because they just keep on building more cruise missiles. It's a multi-billion-dollar bonanza. But the ultimate, and Dr. Greer talks about this, and there's a lot of reference works indicating that we could be heading in this direction now. The ultimate ace in the hole card, because when we talk about these black budget programs, in the intelligence community, they use three terms. They're called ace in the hole technologies, they're called trump card technology, and they're called silver bullet technologies. The best way to increase defense spending might be to create a false flag alien invasion using these craft that look just like alien craft, alien extraterrestrial UFOs, to fool the public into thinking we're being invaded to justify spending billions on more additional arms. This could be the ultimate arms bonanza, and we could be very close to such a scenario right now. In the mid-1990s, Lockheed merged with Martin Marietta to become Lockheed Martin. And I always thought it was interesting that of all the defense contractors that Lockheed could have merged with, they chose Martin Company, which was the company that spearheaded the gravity research in the mid-1950s. This is referenced by Nick Cook's book, Hunt for Zero Point, where he drills down really deep on Martin. They're the company that spearheaded the gravity research. So when you put the power of the Lockheed Skunk Works and you add that together with the original gravity research by Martin, you've got a superstar team. And so it's no wonder that Lockheed merged with that particular company above all others. And according to Ben Rich, anything you can imagine the Skunk Works can do. We've got the technology. Let's talk a little bit about how they keep the secrets. I'll give you an example. The Have Blue program first flew at Groom Lake, Area 51 in 1977. That program led to the F-117A stealth fighter program. That particular project was not acknowledged to the public until November the 10th of 1988. So they had successfully kept that stealth program hidden for over an entire decade before American public had any specific details on that project. So when they want to, when they really want to, they can keep a secret. One way they can keep this secret is by compartmentalizing the information. You have a contractor that builds a landing gear. You have another contractor in another state who builds a flap for a wing section. You have another contractor that builds a very specialized seat ejection system. But these guys don't get together. So no one person from those contractors knows the whole story. That's how they're able to keep the secret, by compartmentalizing the information. Talking about the Russian space shuttle, if the Russians do anything well, they are very good at copying American technology. They did that with the World War II B-29. They made an exact replica of ours that looks just like our B-29. They did the same thing with the shuttle. That flew in the 1980s. Although it did not fly manned, it did one flight that was unmanned, and I don't think it ever flew again. That was called the Buran. It's sitting in a warehouse somewhere in Russia at this time, just derelict and falling apart. So they can duplicate a lot of our technology. When you talk about these super secret, unacknowledged special access programs, by far the United States is well into the lead of this. There is no other country on earth that puts as much research and development and funding into these projects like the U.S. military Defense Department establishment. In fact, we pour so many black budget funding into these projects, we spend more than the fiscal year funding for entire countries. We're way beyond the gross national product of other countries. So yes, we are the leader, there's no question. During and after World War II, there were multiple B-29 flights over the Antarctic region, and they had all the cameras rolling where these saucer-shaped craft would come up from these ice sections and even emerge from the water and follow our B-29s with all the cameras and instruments rolling. All that was put on film and sent to some large warehouse that we've never seen. So if we wanted proof that at least some UFOs are real, the proof is there. They've got it. They've got it in the form of motion picture, high-resolution camera footage, but that footage has never been shared with the American public. I would say that what Gary allegedly stated he saw would be credible, because if it wasn't credible, why would the United States government be interested in extraditing him to America over a 10-year period? I mean, it destroyed this guy mentally. So you have to give Gary credit for that. He also talked about at least 2 craft that he discovered during his search. He talked about the USS Roscoe Hill Encoder, and he talked about the USS Curtis LeMay. So that would stand for United States Spaceship, an off-planet type secret space program. Curtis LeMay was very well into U.S. Air Force operations. They called him Bombs Away LeMay. He was instrumental in forming the B-52. So it stands to reason that out of a respect for Curtis LeMay, they would have named something after him. We don't have a U.S. aircraft carrier called the Curtis LeMay, so that may be what Gary saw with the USS Curtis LeMay. I actually believe his story. All I would reference would be that Mexican newspaper report that talked about how Admiral Byrd said that if we were in our next war, we'd have to fight an enemy that could travel from pole to pole at an incredible speed. I believe that's an honest, accurate quote, and I believe that Admiral Byrd did run into some type of craft out there. What it was, I don't know. Was it part of this Nazi breakaway group? Difficult to prove, but we've got to go back to those B-29 encounters and those motion picture film reels where there's no question they did record saucer-shaped craft following our B-29s. So there's something to that story. That comes from Wendell Stevens, who actually, on a handcuffed linkage chain to a briefcase, he carried that film to an Air Force courier, and that courier went to somewhere like Andrews Air Force Base, and this went on for many times. We've got also references that talk about how these B-29s, with all their cameras rolling, captured this footage. So the real reference to this is the late Wendell Stevens, who talked about this. And it's well known. This did take place. This did take place. That represents some of the most bombshell evidence that would ever be released if they did release it. Those B-29 flights and that gun camera footage, they had electromagnetic instruments on board that recorded all of this, and there were multiple flights. If there was any question about physical evidence used to make the case for this, it would be those film reels. That could do it. That could do it. It's just my personal assessment that before we can disclose the alleged extraterrestrial reality to this phenomenon, we have to disclose the man-made part of it first. I mean, doesn't that make sense that we should take and disclose and release the terrestrial end before we can jump on something that's even more exotic than that? So it's my job to track, to identify, to disclose to the best of my ability the man-made nuts and bolts military aerospace defense contractor end of this, because these vehicles can be mistaken many times for something that we think might be an extraterrestrial vehicle. And the only way that I know of to do that is to interview the Lockheed Skunk Works engineers, interview the test pilots, drill down on the university archives, get into the Aviation Week articles, and track the historical research and the legacy of the gravity research and how that started in the mid-1950s and has gone all the way to today, and looking at the funding, looking at all the defense contractors, points you into the direction of multiple defense contractors building these saucer, triangular, and boomerang-shaped craft that look just like extraterrestrial UFOs, but are our own man-made vehicles, and that's what I've endeavored to do. It could potentially be a beautiful future. It will be a non-polluting future. It'll be a future with beautiful rivers, lakes, and oceans, and it'll be a future where we go exo-interplanetary. We're not going to be just confined to Earth. We're going to go to the planets. We're going to go to the outer solar system. We're going to go beyond and make this interstellar. And we're going to populate other planets around other solar systems. No question about it. We have to do it. We're going to do it. Phoenix Lights, that's March 13th, 1997, seen by thousands of people in the Phoenix area. Certainly got right into this Phoenix Sky Harbor airspace, but I want to point out that the sighting actually started in Nevada at around 7:55 p.m., made its way all the way down to Tucson later that evening. Now, how do flares go from Nevada all the way down to Tucson? Flares only describe part of the Phoenix Lights. Now, this was a Thursday night, March 13th, 1997. I have an illustration here that was done by a good friend of mine, Tom Bogan. He's got to get the credit for this. And ladies and gentlemen, this is the most detailed, minute-by-minute, illustrative, time-stamp illustration that you ever see of the Phoenix Lights craft. There is no one who's done a better job than Tom Bogan. As you can see here, it started up at 8:15 over here in Paulden, Nevada, worked its way down 8:30 at Sunset Point, came over here 8:45, continuing to move south over here by the South Mountain, 9 o'clock, and it actually finished up here at 9:30 p.m. in Tucson. You can see the flares in this location. So bottom line is, flares do not explain the entire sighting of the Phoenix Lights, March 13th, 1997. Now, we also have another document to consider as well, and that comes in the form of this document right here. This is the Air Force 2025 report, and this is a wish list of what the U.S. Air Force would see they would like to see this implemented by the year 2025. And as you go through this document, they have all these different configurations, different technologies they'd like to see. But I want to bring your attention to this particular technology right here. It isn't talked about too much, but it is section 5.6, airborne holographic projector. And I'll just read the narrative here. It says the holographic projector displays a three-dimensional visual image in a desired location removed from the display generator. The projector can be used for psychological operations and strategic perception management. It is also useful for optical deception and cloaking, providing a momentary distraction when engaging an unsophisticated adversary. So, is this a possible Rosetta Stone for the Phoenix Lights craft? Talking about an airborne holographic projector, something that could be projected from another aircraft flying in the vicinity. This is something that we need to consider on the Phoenix Lights craft. And I say that because many of the eyewitnesses who saw that vehicle on March 13th, 1997, hovered directly over the location, stated that the craft had fuzzy edges. They weren't sharp. That might be indicative of a holographic image projection technology, which is borne out by the 2025 report. This is the configuration that was seen by Tim Lee over his house. It was such a low type flyover that he said he could hit it with a baseball. That's how low it was. National Geographic Channel came back later, interviewed him. They actually did a laser target designator GPS measurement. They came down within plus or minus 10 feet. This thing was 1,500 feet across. That's how big this was. And that could be a holographic projection. That's one thing that we need to consider. Okay, so let's look at this really quickly. When we talk about the military-industrial complex, the aerospace end of the military-industrial complex, we're talking about something called Aerospace Alley. That is from San Diego all the way up toward the Los Angeles basin, heading northeast on the 14 to Lancaster, Palmdale, going to the Mojave Edwards Air Force Base. That's the corridor that we're talking about. Now, what is the heart of that aerospace complex? It is Air Force Plant 42, which I've got a map here showing you the direction and how to get there. Take 14 north. This will take you to Lancaster, Palmdale. This is Air Force Plant 42. This, ladies and gentlemen, is where the action takes place at this location. Over the years, McDonnell Douglas has had a laboratory here. Lockheed absolutely has a facility here. Rockwell has a facility here where they built the space shuttle. Northrop has a facility. Boeing has a facility. But for this particular discussion, we want to focus in on the Lockheed plant, and that's this detailed layout right here. This is Plant 10, the Lockheed Skunk Works, and it's been stated that 80% of what the Skunk Works does is completely classified. So it's not known to the general public what they do, but that takes place in this building complex right here. Building 601 is one of the primary facilities where sub-assemblies of these aircraft are put together. So this is just a brief overview. Air Force Plant 42, Lockheed Skunk Works Plant 10 is within that section. This is where the action takes place. A-12 Avenger 2, as we mentioned before, this is a McDonnell Douglas General Dynamics program. It was canceled by Dick Cheney in 1991 at the cost of $5 billion to taxpayers. There's absolutely nothing left of the A-12 program. Despite all that money, it's all gone. It's like a total waste. And this is just kind of a poster child for how these programs, when they're basically, they tried to make this a fixed price contract, but the cost overruns went out of control. They eventually canceled the program. What about the programs we don't know about? A12 is just an example of one that we do. What about the programs that we don't know about that got shoved under the carpeting? We could be talking about billions of dollars that have been wasted that could have actually helped American citizens in the economy. It could have improved the education. It could have retrofitted our infrastructure, something to consider. But again, A12 Avenger 2, $5 billion down the drain. I want to make a special mention of the TR-3B. This is the ubiquitous TR-3B flying triangle. The reference for this is Edgar Fouché, who unfortunately I must announce that he passed away, but he has to get the credit for breaching the subject of the TR-3B. It was unknown prior to him coming out in 1998 where he discussed this. But basically what he described is something that he saw at Groom Lake back in 1979, parked on the tarmac near an avionics lab when he was going onto a bus. He stated that he actually saw this vehicle parked at Area 51. He described there being two different sizes, one being 300 feet per side. The other one was 600 feet per side. Had multiple different missions. It could be used as a troop transport, cargo transport. It also had what he termed at least 2 nuclear reactors, which served as the power source for something called the magnetic field disruptor. And what they would do is they would take a pressurized liquid mercury that was rotated at 50,000 RPM and pressurized to 250,000 atmospheres. And when you do that, it has the capability of altering or warping the localized gravity field, thereby reducing the G-forces by 89%. So when you see these craft, these triangle craft, making these 90-degree right-angle turns, stopping on a dime, reversing direction, making these 40 G turns, with this technology, they have the technology, they can do it. According to Edgar Fouché, he saw it in 1979. So that may explain a lot of the UFO sightings that we've seen of these big black delta flying triangles that have been seen all around the world since at least 1974, 1975 timeframe. So I just want to give credit to Edgar Fouché, who was the first one to breach the subject. All right, how do we track the funding? How do we track the funding? This was a watershed article. Detroit Free Press. Secret ledger hides military projects. Pentagon black budget has tripled under the Reagan administration. So how do we track the black budget? What can we as a taxpayer do to see where our money is being hidden? Well, you as a taxpayer can walk right into the Library of Congress. You can go up to the reference librarian and you can request something called RDT&E Programs R1. That stands for Research Development, Test and Evaluation Programs R1, Department of Defense. And you can go through this rather boring and wordy document here. And on the left-hand side, you see the program element number and then the item description and the funding, how much they poured into that program. So the bottom line is you take the total amount and you subtract the knowns, and what you're left with are the unknowns or the black budget programs. That's how you can track these projects. Now, they don't give you specific details of what the project is, but you as a taxpayer can walk right into the Library of Congress. You can request this document and they'll give it to you. And that's one way that you can figure out where your tax dollars are disappearing to over the last 40 years. Every January, this is handed to Congress. This is the unclassified version. They get a classified version. We as taxpayers, we get an unclassified version. Let's go back to the, I've got the breakdown on this. I've got the blow-up chart on this. But in this particular case, you can see this is the federal spending by category, and they break it down to each department. So on the left-hand side, you see that during the beginning of the Reagan administration in 1981, the black budget increased by just over $500 million. By 1988, it increased by $9.122 billion. Here's federal spending by category. The Pentagon's black budget was $35 billion for fiscal year 1988. Transportation was $28 billion. Education was $25 billion. So we're spending more on classified black budgets funding programs than we are for education. Total procurement funding for the Air Force for fiscal year 1988 was $51.1 billion, of which $19.1 billion were black budget programs for fiscal year 1988. And it has just gone up from that point forward. It has just exponentially grown from the end of the Reagan administration. We're talking about billions of dollars being filtered into these black programs. Now, we need to talk about one program in specific that is close to my heart, because this is a tremendous amount of research has gone. This is basically a world exclusive here. We're talking about a program that had its beginnings basically immediately after the Challenger explosion, January 28th, 1986, where we lost these 7 Challenger astronauts with Krista McAuliffe, who was the teacher. At that point, the Air Force lost what they termed their assured access to space, because as we know, the shuttle program is in point of fact not a civilian operation, but is in point of fact a military application, because at least 70% of payloads within the shuttle are classified DoD satellites, things that are operated by the National Reconnaissance Office, like high-resolution monitoring satellites, keyhole satellites. That's the kind of things that were launched within the shuttle. Now, when the shuttle exploded, when Challenger exploded January 28th, 1986, they lost their assured access to space, and they started launching these satellites on Titan boosters. But something weird happened. Concurrently with the Challenger explosion, there were multiple Titan booster explosions as well. So the Air Force, the DoD, they were totally out of business. And so a desperate cry went to the defense contractors, including Lockheed, Boeing, McDonnell Douglas, and Rockwell. And they basically stated, we need you to design for us a rapid response 2-stage to orbit space plane that they can build quickly, very quickly. Something that could go into a low Earth orbit, that could launch depleted uranium rods from God, or also launch a very high-resolution spy satellite, a very small, high-resolution spy satellite. And what they ended up building was a 2-stage to orbit space plane. And what you're looking at here is an event that took place at Holloman Air Force Base, where a modified C-5 Galaxy with what they called chipmunk cheek extensions was seen being unloaded from a C-5 Galaxy. There was a tarp on the parasitic aircraft that had 4 linear aerospike engines on the back side of the vehicle, with this grid or vent part on the aft section of the nozzle of the linear aerospike engines. Here is the detailed drawing of what was termed Speedy, part of the Black Star program. It was called the XOV, or Experimental Orbital Vehicle. It came in 2 sizes. There was a 60 to 65 foot version and also a 95 foot version. It has 4 linear aerospike engines that are grouped in 2 banks on the aft side of the vehicle. The bottom surface here was completely composed of space shuttle tiles. So just think of these black space shuttle tiles on the bottom of the vehicle. It also had these channels that were kind of milled into the bottom of the craft to direct airflow and to increase the strength of the vehicle. This is the section here where the Q bay was that launched these satellites. And then I also want to mention that the nose gear had what we believe 4 standard bogies for the nose gear, and then it had a skid for the main gear, and then outrigger pogos for kind of a supporting structure on the outrigger section of the landing gear. So that's the Speedy XOV. Now the mothership that actually launches that aircraft is this aircraft right here. This is the what's termed the Elegant Lady or Black Star space plane mothership. It looks very much like the vintage 1960s XB-70, but the primary difference being that the vertical stabilizers on the XB-70 have now been moved out to the wingtips as winglets. And then it has a forward and aft retracting canard with winglets on there. Here's a bottom view here. So this is section AA. If you go to section AA, you can see the relieved section of the bottom of the XB-70 mothership has a section which is allowing the parasitic aircraft to fit up inside. So basically picture an ice cream scooper taking out the bottom of the XB-70 vehicle, allowing for this parasitic aircraft to fit conformally on the bottom of this craft, and that is airdropped when they're basically getting their operation going. And so this is the Black Star two-stage to orbit spaceplane transportation system. Bill Scott has to get credit for doing the legwork and actually breaking this story in Aviation Week Space Technology. So this is just a brief overview of the Black Star program. So what we've got here is kind of a brief overview, a collage of aircraft that I mentioned have been tested, designed, and built within the military-industrial complex. That's the Reagan years between 1981 to 1989. A tremendous amount of black aircraft research was done in the black world within that time frame. That's extremely important to keep in mind because that's when these things really started getting funding. We can start here on the left-hand side and we'll work our way down here. But before we begin, our story actually begins in 1974 with a DARPA-funded program called Harvey. This is Project Harvey, was a procurement program by the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency to design, build, and test fly a low observable stealth aircraft that could sneak in under the radar screen of enemy radar and basically hit their target and come in and return safely. Now that was something very difficult to do back in 1974 because this is an emerging technology. Okay, what I've done is I've built a scale model here. They eventually identified two aerospace contractors. This is Northrop and Lockheed for this Project Harvey competition. Lockheed eventually won the program with their Have Blue design, which eventually came into the existence of the F-117A stealth fighter. But Northrop's version, which is a lot less known, was a program called Project XST, Experimental Survivable Testbed. And although they didn't make it into production, they did build basically a 1-to-1 scale radar cross-section model. This is a replica of that model. And you can see it's got this diamond configuration. It's got the faceted flat plates just like on the F-117A, and then it's got these twin inward canted vertical stabilizers. It also has an air intake on top of the fuselage of the aircraft, although Lockheed's Have Blue featured an air intake on either side of the pilot's compartment. So the concept being, if you have an enemy radar that strikes this aircraft in a regular standard Tier 1 type aircraft, the radar return would go directly back to the origin point. That's exactly what you don't want to happen. In this design, you've got faceted flat plates that are at an angle. So when the radar is transmitted toward the aircraft, it bounces and reflects away from the origin point, so it doesn't show up as an echo on the radar from the enemy. And that's what you want in a stealth aircraft. Anytime you deal with government spending, the first rule in government spending is why build one when you can build two at twice the price. So I went ahead and built a 2X size version of the Northrop XST, Exact same configuration, but just twice as large. Here you can see the overhead air intake, the faceted flat plate technology, the diamond configuration for the wing platform, and the twin inward canted vertical stabilizers. Neutral and non-biased. That's our job. That's our mandate. So we have to eliminate every terrestrial explanation before saying that something is possibly extraterrestrial. And that's what I've tried to do with this research, tracking the test pilots, tracking the engineers, tracking the procurement funding, the black world, what they've been doing in the black world the past 50 years. That's my goal. We are now going to move on to the Hudson Valley boomerang. That's between 1982 and 1989, where 25,000 eyewitnesses saw a gigantic boomerang V-shaped aircraft hover over the Taconic State Parkway, over populated areas, over freeways, over reservoirs, ponds, lakes, and rivers. We're talking about probably the most significant UFO sighting in ufology, period. Just on numbers alone, the Hudson Valley wave represents a gigantic UFO sighting. Now we'll start here at this beginning part here. What people are reporting is something that is as large as a football field, a massive boomerang V-shaped craft that had what the eyewitnesses termed, quote, tubes, pipes, and cylinders on the bottom of the vehicle. Many of the eyewitnesses also reported that on the bottom of the craft, when this thing was hovering over the Taconic State Parkway, they saw what looked like transparent panels where you could look up inside the craft, revealing what they termed a cross beam and girder construction, like a truss bridge. So that's very interesting bottom structure. Also, people who were under this craft and actually saw this vehicle stated that when it had these flashing lights, the lights would flash in sequence. They weren't haphazard, but they went off where the reds would go off, then the blues would go off, then the greens would go off, then the whites would go off, then the yellows would go off. And this would go up and down the wings, so it was an intent for the light pattern. There was a sequence for the light pattern. Here you can see an enlargement of the crossbeam and girder construction, and this is the different configurations of the lighting pattern. But bottom line is, we're talking about 25,000 eyewitnesses over an approximate 10-year period who saw this massive silent craft. Now, I've built a model here. This particular craft was seen in 1983 by a woman named Monique O'Driscoll near Kent, New York. Her daughter, also named Monique, was with her as well. This particular craft passed directly over her vehicle. She was looking outside the windshield as this thing passed over, and it parked itself over a frozen lake. So there was ice on the bottom. This thing did a 180-degree flat turn and had all these flashing lights on the bottom that she could see reflecting on the ice below. So we're not talking about ultralights here. We're not talking about planes flying in formation. Now, one way we know that is because according to the FAA regulations, ultralights are prohibited from flying a half an hour after sunset. Many of the Hudson Valley boomerang sightings were 9:30, 10:30 p.m. or later, so we can rule out ultralights. But the point I want to make is when these craft made a turn, they did not bank like a B-2 stealth bomber. They did this absolute flat 180-degree turn where all the lights remain equidistant as this thing turned. Now I'm going to move on to another one here. Particularly what was seen over the Taconic State Parkway on March the 24th, 1983. Now keep in mind, that's exactly 24 hours after Ronald Reagan gave his address to the nation pitching the SDI, or Star Wars program. So I'm asking the question, is there a tie-in between Star Wars SDI and what was seen exactly 24 hours later on a Thursday night? We could be looking at a tie-in here. Here you can see the multicolored lights, you can see the composite panels, and what I want to stress is the fact that when this aircraft turned, it was parking itself over the Taconic State Parkway, and I've got a map here showing you how on the March 24th, 1983, it was heading north from Millwood all the way up to Yorktown Heights. and it was zigzagging as it was going up the Taconic State Parkway. Now keep in mind, this is absolutely dead silent at treetop level. We're not talking about planes flying in formation here. This thing was bold, it was arrogant, it was brazen. It didn't care who saw it. It was going to go where it wanted, when it wanted. So it was a very arrogant type flight path. Now, the point I want to make is when it parked itself over the Taconic State Parkway, and you can see the bottom view here, when it turned, it made this flat turn 180 degrees with absolutely no bank angle. You just can't get that with standard aerodynamics. You're not going to get that with planes flying in formation. So we can rule out the plane theory. Okay, so we'll start up here on the left-hand corner. This is a scale model built by Tony Gonzalez, who's unfortunately no longer with us. But he's the one who first proposed the possible tie-in between the original stealth bomber configuration and the redesign after 1983. Here you can see the original configuration of the B-2 stealth bomber with a single triangle trailing edge. And then after 1983, at the cost of $1 billion per taxpayer to the taxpayers, they redesigned the wing to the familiar double W or sawtooth trailing edge that we see today. Now, this pre-1983 design is exactly, repeat, exactly what the Hudson Valley boomerang eyewitnesses are reporting. A boomerang shape with a triangle trailing edge. Exactly what they're reporting. He's even got the composite panels where you can see up inside the aircraft. So this is Tony Gonzalez model here. Again, this is the tubes, pipes, and cylinders. A lot of the eyewitnesses stated that this craft looked like an inverted Midas muffler shop with all these pipes, all these cylinders. The same tubes, pipes, and cylinders were seen on the bottom of the Belgium Triangle in 1989-1990. The same tubes, pipes, and cylinders were also identified on the January 5th, 2000 Southern Illinois Triangle case, which we'll examine as well. Kent, New York, February 26, 1983. That's the one with Monique O'Driscoll, who saw this parked over a frozen pond. It made newspapers all around the world. In 1984, they had a conference with over 1,000 people in attendance. ABC News was there, CBS News was there, NBC News was there. Multiple eyewitnesses were interviewed. Questions fly over Putnam. Hundreds claim to have seen UFO. Local UFOs called historical and interesting. Absolutely, they are historical and interesting. Multiple sightings in New York. Now, on July 24th, 1984, an absolutely massively significant sighting took place over the Indian Point nuclear power plant. This is July 24th, 1984, and this is in Buchanan, New York. And on that night, right around 9:30, 10:30 time frame, a massive 900-foot long boomerang triangular aircraft parked itself over Reactor 3 at the Indian Point nuclear power plant for approximately 20 minutes with 12 security guards who had shotguns pointed at this thing with their mouths wide open, were absolutely shocked by what they saw. Now, we have it on very good authority from one of the security guards that was present at this event, that one security guard who was in one of these adjacent buildings was recording all this on videotape, and he said that, quote, this craft was so large he had to pan the camera 180 degrees to get the whole thing in frame. That's how big this thing crap was. So at the very least, there is a videotape of this in existence, but we don't have it. It was confiscated later. This is a couple of illustrations of what this craft looked like on the bottom. This is over the Taconic State Parkway on the lower section here. Now, many eyewitnesses reported seeing that this craft had a very powerful spotlight that was shining down on the cars below. This is March 24th, 1983. So again, we're not talking about ultralights in formation. Again, you see the multicolored lights in this location here, and the tubes, pipes, and cylinders with a very mechanical understructure. We'll consider a couple of the different newspaper clippings here. Valley UFO sighting, spark interest. Lower Hudson UFO. This also took place near the Danbury, Connecticut area here. So we've got a multi-state sighting within the Hudson Valley boomerang. UFO or B2. That was done by Tony Gonzalez, who traveled around that 3-state region giving lectures on his proposal and the possibility of the connection between the Hudson Valley Boomerang original pre-1983 design and what was procured under SDI funding. This is the original configuration here, and then moving on to the after or post-1983 connection. So, just to sum up on the Hudson Valley Boomerang, at the very least, we're talking about 25,000 eyewitnesses, an entire cross-section of society, test pilots, engineers, lawyers, doctors, air traffic controllers, all credible witnesses describing an incredible, massive boomerang-shaped craft that hovers silently, has multicolored flashing lights, and can make this 180-degree flat turn, which may be something funded under the SDI program. And no discussion about classified aircraft would be complete without talking about the triangles. Black triangles have been seen all around the world. The modern day sightings of triangles, repeat, modern day sightings, basically got kicked off around 1974. But what we want to focus in on is this group of sightings right here, 1989, 1990. The absolute pinnacle of those sightings is the Belgium Triangle Wave, 1989, 1990, where upwards of 10,000 people reported a gigantic triangular-shaped aircraft that they stated was about 2 times the size of a football field, in some cases as large as an aircraft carrier. We're talking about a massive craft that had the same flight characteristics of the Hudson Valley Boomerang. It was a very silent configuration. It had a white light at each of the corner that you can see in this Sun newspaper article, July 23rd, 1991, and then one red or amber light in the middle section of the triangle. But they also had tubes, pipes, and cylinders on the bottom of the aircraft. Many of the eyewitnesses reported an electrical humming noise, like kind of a machine operating in the background. Also, eyewitnesses indicated that they heard what they termed a sound like a sewing machine too. That was also heard in the Hudson Valley Boomerang. People who were just adjacent to this particular aircraft said that they could see what looked like windows on the side of the craft, and this craft had the capability of basically dropping totally steady into a hover and then going from horizon to horizon and back again in less than 1 second. So we're not talking about standard aerodynamics here. This craft was confirmed on 5 separate radars, which is the 2 F-16s that were scrambled, which you can see here. This is 1990 on March 30th when 2 F-16s were scrambled, and then 3 ground-based radars also confirmed a hard target. So when you've got 3 ground-based and 2 air-based targets confirmed on radar, you've got something real here. We're not talking about something fictitious. Now, moving over here, you can see different configurations of the triangle. I've included a very detailed drawing of something that was seen in Madison, Wisconsin on November 22nd, 1985. A very interesting triangular configuration that had these tubes, pipes, and cylinders crisscrossing on the bottom of the aircraft. And I'll just read very quickly what the eyewitness stated here. It says, quote, "The underside of the craft resembled the back of a refrigerator, like a collection of condensation pipes that ran back and forth." Now, we need to ask ourselves, is this something that you would expect to see on an alien spacecraft? In fact, I built a model of this craft, and you can see this is what the bottom of this particular vehicle looked like, with all these pipes running back and forth. Again, this very mechanical understructure was also seen on the Hudson Valley Boomerang between 1983, 82 time period, all the way up to 1989. This is the case for November 22nd, 1985. So the sightings have absolutely continued. Now we're going to consider this particular case. This was seen by a group of 4 individuals around 9:30 p.m. This is Monks, Kirby, England. This is 1999, March the 31st. When they were returning from a dinner outing, what they actually saw were red lights on the left side of the road. Off on a 25-degree angle, there were 4 red lights. As they got closer, they noticed that these red lights were connected to what looked like a diamond configuration. And what you see here, when you have a nose down configuration, you'll actually see this smaller light here, and they did identify that. As they got closer to this vehicle, they saw that these lights were connected to some type of a craft. As they further got close to this craft, which was not too far off the surface of the ground, this particular vehicle made a very interesting maneuver. It looked like it was underwater. That's the testimony by Colin Saunders, who's the primary eyewitness. This thing did a 90-degree rotation, but it did it as it was looking like it was underwater. It was a very smooth rotation, and the pivot point was the back of the craft itself. It wasn't the center axis of the vehicle, but it rotated from the bottom and came up. He also identified on the top surface kind of like a liquid mercury shimmering effect that was on the top surface and bottom surface of this vehicle. It also was composed of these box-like raised structures that, in his opinion, were kind of a docking mechanism to a much larger wing-shaped craft that flew not too long after this was sighted. So again, this is the Colin Saunders Flying Triangle, Monks, Kirby, England, March 31st, 1999. This was seen by one particular gentleman who was coming back from a music concert. This is Barnsley, England, August 25th, 1990. As he was exiting this concert, there was a lot of cars in his way, so it took him a while to get going. But as he was driving home, he looked out his window and he saw emerging from this dark, misty cloud a massive triangular-shaped aircraft that was approximately 200 feet per side. It had windows on the side of the vehicle, but then on the bottom of the craft, he saw what looked like cross-beam and girder construction, which is the same structure that we heard about on the Hudson Valley Boomerang. There was one light on the corner of the vehicle, identical to the Belgium Triangle wave, and then another white light here in the center. But he said that when he was seeing this craft, he saw what looked like human beings, test pilots, looking back at him, and he said that there was nothing about these pilots or humans looking at him through these windows that gave him the impression that it was anything other than just human pilots, reinforcing his belief that this was a military project. So this is another one of these mechanical understructures that we've seen. I've gotten at least 12 separate cases of this very interesting mechanical structure on the bottom of the vehicle. This was seen by Maureen Davis. This is November 1985 in Yorktown Heights, New York, right at the height of the Hudson Valley Boomerang wave. She was waiting at a bus stop for her husband, and she witnessed a massive 75-degree isosceles black flying triangle hovering not too far from her location, a massive craft. And when she was interviewed by Linda Zimmerman, who's a very good researcher on the Hudson Valley wave, she was stated that this particular craft was not as big as a football field. It was as big as a football stadium. That's how large this craft was. Now, what's interesting about her sighting is she got under this vehicle and was able to look up inside the craft itself. She said that there was an opening that just sort of appeared, and then a red orb came up and went inside that opening, and she saw what looked like terraced apartment complexes with multiple lights connected to each floor. And so this was her sighting. This is November of 1985 at the height of the Hudson Valley Boomerang wave. Now, we're going to move on to January 5th, 2000, which is the Southern Illinois Triangle case. This was seen by at least 3 police officers in multiple counties. Lebanon was seen in Summerfield. It was seen in Shiloh, Millstout, Dupo. This is about 25 miles east of St. Louis. And what they observed were at least 3 different triangular configurations and one particular craft that looked like a single-story ranch with a penthouse on top. Primary eyewitness was a miniature golf course owner and truck driver by the name of Melvin Knoll, and he saw this about a quarter mile away from his location, And this craft was just silently flying by. He said that this thing had multiple lighted colored windows on the side of the craft and then a lighted penthouse on top, flying silently near his location. He said that this particular craft was about a football field in size. Other eyewitnesses, who include the police officer, stated that the bottom of the acute triangle craft had a very mechanical understructure, but he said in this case it looked like stacked Legos with tubes sticking down. And these craft also made these very interesting maneuvers where they were just hovering silently and then they shot away like a spark off a grinding wheel and left no sonic boom. So again, we're talking about an exotic type propulsion system. This is an actual scale model that was done by a firefighter who actually saw this vehicle as well. So we've got multiple eyewitnesses to this triangular and box-like rectangular craft. This is January 5th, 2000 for that particular case. Now we'll also consider this particular case. This is the Flying Truss Bridge. I got this from the UFOs archives. This is March 5th, 2003. It had been buried in the UFOs archives for years, may have never seen the light of day if I wasn't fortunate enough to gain access to the UFOs archives and pull it out. But this particular individual, and I have his multi-page report and technical drawing, he stated here that as this massive football field in length triangle flew over his house, it rumbled the house so severely that it knocked pictures off the wall. That's how much of a frequency this thing left. But what I want to bring your attention to is this truss beam cross girder construction. And he stated that it looked like this particular craft was fastened by rivets from a bridge, like the George Washington Bridge or even the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. And again, he stated that this thing was fastened, what he stated were these rusty rivets from a bridge. So I'm asking the question, is this an alien spacecraft that we're talking about here? We are looking at a man-made technology. We can see that from the funding, multiple billions of dollars have been run into these programs. They have no congressional oversight. They have no public scrutiny. A lot of these aircraft may in point of fact be funded under the Star Wars SDI program stemming from the 1983 address to the nation on March 23rd. And we could be looking in some of these cases of these boomerang, these triangles, of a airborne, mobile, over-the-horizon radar system that is impervious to Russian ICBM attacks. And that's something that we really need to consider. That could be one explanation for these triangles. So that's just a brief overview of some of the flying triangles that have been seen all around the world, stemming from at least 1974. The only thing that I would recommend to others in this field, the general public, people maybe watching this, is according to the Declaration of Independence by our founding forefathers, it is our constitutional right, it is our constitutional obligation to question authority. So we have every right to question where our tax dollars are disappearing. We have a right to demand an accounting from our congressional leaders. It's in our original mandate to do so. So you shouldn't feel embarrassed to ask about these programs. It's nothing to be ashamed of. Our documents that you can get from the Library of Congress, our own documents prove that we should have an accounting on a yearly basis of these programs. Yet that's not done because we only get the unclassified version of that classified budget. So a lot more of these programs should actually see the light of day, and that technology needs to be declassified and handed into the scientific community. First, I would say, Mr. President or Mrs. President, it's an honor to meet you. I just want to inform you that as a temporary employee of the United States, you are not 100% read in and briefed on all classified programs within the boundary of unacknowledged special access programs. That would be the first thing, that you're just not briefed and you do not have a high enough clearance to know everything that's going on at Edwards North Base Complex, at the remote test site in Nevada, and multiple other installations within the intelligence community and the military defense contractor. I would advise you to follow where the money leads and give the American taxpayer what they paid for, okay? And I'd like you to declassify 10 to 20% of previously unknown classified programs per that original Declaration of Independence, where it's our law, it's our mandate, it is our right to question authority, and please do so at your earliest convenience.